After the meeting, 2 Democratic members of the House in attendance spoke to reporters. We'll hear first from Vermont Congressman Peter Welch.
It was a comprehensive meeting where we talked about tax policy, infrastructure, DACA, health care, and also a broken process. And the interesting thing about it is it's the first time that Republicans and Democrats have been in the same room talking about those topics. One of the points a number of us made, Republicans and Democrats, is that the process in the House is broken. There's no interaction. And the president made the point that the most significant legislation has to have bipartisan support. We haven't had that. So in that respect, it was quite appreciated that the president invited both sides. On the tax issue that's coming up, that's the most dominant right now. The president repeated what he said in his original address about it being pro-growth and pro-middle class, indicated explicitly that this would not be a tax cut.
That's hard, mate. You could find the cameras by yourself.
It wasn't that hard.
That's fantastic. Thanks for coming over.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. In terms of the broad general principles, the president recited what he said before, and basically everybody will be a winner. The question is, when the ink is dry, will you be able to do the math and see that, in fact, middle-class folks, particularly rural America, that elected the president, is going to do better under this proposal or not? The president was quite explicit in saying that there would not be tax cuts for the wealthy. He said he thought that the wealthy would be the same, but possibly even higher. But he was indicating that this was not going to result in lower taxes for high-income people. So we need pen to paper. We don't know whether that's going to be what the outcome is. The bottom line here, our process in the House is broken because there is so little interaction. You know, the health care bill was written primarily in secret. The hope is that the tax bill will start engaging Democrats so that they'll have some input at the table. It's not early on at this point, but that's really going to be important. And then the final thing, DACA, the president has indicated here to us, bipartisan group, sympathy for a lot of the dreamers, and was encouraging us to try to get to a bipartisan solution on that. I think the big political question is going to be whether, when we're considering that distinct group of people who have incredibly compelling stories, of Vermonter, a first-year medical student, came here when he was 9, we're going to get bogged down in other contentious issues related to the immigration debate, and we don't know at this point. But all in all, I would say we were 2 of the Democrats, Tom Suozzi and I, who were present, and we appreciated the opportunity to visit with our Republican colleagues, and in real time, both of us have input into those topics in the real attention of the president. He listened carefully. He was very engaged, and we appreciate his outreach.
So this is Peter Welch from Vermont. I'm Tom Suozzi from New York. I'm the vice chairman of the Problem Solvers Caucus from the Democratic side. And I concur with everything that Peter had to say. The people in America are sick of politics and politicians, and they want us to get things done. And the only way we're going to get things done is by working together. And that doesn't mean we're going to agree on everything, but we have to work together, as Peter said, returning to regular order, where we negotiate our way through to try and solve problems on behalf of the American people. As Peter pointed out, healthcare was one of the topics, DACA was one of the topics, and tax reform and infrastructure were the other 2 topics. And instead of me giving a soliloquy like Peter just did, you can just ask any questions you want to ask.
Congressman, what reassurances did the president give you that he'll follow through on his word not to cut taxes on the wealthiest 1%?
I think he repeated it many times throughout the conversation that we had just now. He made a point over and over again that this is not about giving tax cuts to the wealthy. Quite frankly, it wouldn't succeed. You wouldn't get any bipartisan support if it was tax cuts for the wealthy. He also made the point that any other tax reforms, it's all about job creation. We as Democrats recognize that the president resonated during his campaign with people that have been left behind by globalization and technology, and they want to make a better wage in this country. And we need to work together to actually enhance jobs in this country where people can make enough money. That's why the Democrats started talking about this idea of a better deal, a better wage, a better future. Well, it's the same idea of trying to improve jobs for people in America where they can make enough money so they can afford to live the American dream.
But it's a good question, because bottom line, we're past the talking stage, and it's really what's on the paper and what's the analysis. And when the ink dries, will it result in achieving the goals the president laid out? If it does, that would be good, but we'll see.
Did the president identify any kind of tax deductions that you may want to cap or get rid of, or any specifics on that?
He didn't. He was general. Mr. Cohen was there as well, but the president did not get into specifics. But he indicated he definitely wanted to have Democrats involved. We haven't been involved as yet.
One of our colleagues made clear that they would not support state and local tax reduction being eliminated as an exemption.
How did the president respond to that?
He listened.
He listened.
Yeah, and a number of us made the point that we wanted to be revenue neutral, and he listened. So the president listened, and he actively listened. We'll see what happens. I mean, this is in the hands of Paul Ryan much more than anyone else at this point.
On DACA, did the president say on DACA whether he expected money for the border wall, cuts to legal immigration, or other border security measures specifically?
He didn't make specific quid pro quos. I mean, he spoke.
He expected one done before the other, or together?
No, it's clear. He made it clear that he's got a view on immigration, on the wall, on security, on wanting to go to a merit-based system. He said all of that, but he did not make a quid pro quo. And in fact, I advocated that we not make a quid pro quo. That the Dreamers are an exceptional category, and that it doesn't enhance security to evict them from the country.
Much Democratic support for money for the border wall if there was a promise to legalize.
I think the linkage is a real problem for us. I mean, I think we see the Dreamers as a special category of people. They were brought over by their parents. They had nothing to do with the decision to come here, and a lot of them serve in the military. The president was very sympathetic about that. He said it's just not right to take somebody.
The president made the point over again about the idea of merit, and we talked about how the Hispanic caucus in the Democratic side has proposed the Dreamers Act, which is about people that came here when they're younger than 17 years old, are either in the military, or have graduated from high school and are going to college, or have been working steadily for 3 years. And he seemed to be actively listening, as Peter put it.
He listened.
He listened.
Yeah.
He listened. I think he's very sympathetic to people that came here through no fault of their own and are living productive lives here in this country.
Thank you.
How willing the president is to negotiate a 50% corporate tax rate?
We didn't get into discussion about rates.
Well, I think the president did indicate his hope would be on corporate rates it'd be 15. Whether
that
that's
won't
his
receive
hope.
Bipartisan support.
We didn't get a sense. I mean, he understands that, and said explicitly that ideally there'd be bipartisan support on big issues. And by definition, if you really are trying to achieve that goal, then there's going to have to be some give and take.
I mean, the most important thing about this meeting was not necessarily all the specifics. It was the cultural change that took place here, where Democrats and Republicans were sitting together in a room that don't necessarily agree on these issues, but are trying to say, we want to get things done on behalf of the American people, and to do that, we need to do it together.
Thank you. Thanks.
President,
You gotta go.
more of a partner to you as Democrats than the Republican leadership in Congress?
He's having dinner with Chuck and Nancy tonight.
Later, the president hosted a dinner including Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi. After the dinner, they issued this statement. We agreed to enshrine the protections of DACA into law quickly and to work out a package of border security, excluding the wall, that's acceptable to both sides.